The grand ballroom of the celestial embassy stretched before them like a glittering ocean of silk and starlight. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, while beings from 1,000 worlds moved through the space in elegant pairs. Tonight was the annual Harmony Gathering, where representatives from every corner of the galaxy came together to forge new alliances, both political and personal. Queen Lyralei stood at the far end of the ballroom, her ornate crown catching the light like captured moonbeams. The ancient artifact had been passed down through 30 generations of her bloodline, each jewel representing a conquered world, each delicate curve telling the story of her people's rise to power. She wore it now not as a symbol of triumph, but as a beautiful burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The pearl necklaces draped around her throat were worth more than entire star systems. Her gown, woven from silk that could only be found on her distant homeworld, flowed around her like liquid starlight. Everything about her spoke of power, of ancient nobility, of a legacy that stretched back millennia. Yet as she watched the swirling crowd before her, she felt more alone than she had in centuries. Pairs formed and dissolved around her like living poetry. To her left, a crystalline ambassador from the Andromeda sector was deep in conversation with a graceful being whose skin seemed to shift between colors like an aurora. Their hands had found each other naturally, fingers intertwining as they spoke in hushed, intimate tones. Near the center of the room, a delegation of wind dancers from the Spiral Nebula moved in perfect harmony with a group of land walkers from the Outer Rim territories. Even the usually solitary shadow dwellers from the dark matter realms had paired off, finding companionship in this rare gathering of worlds. But no one approached the vampire queen. Lyralei understood why. Her reputation preceded her like a storm front. The stories spoke of worlds drained of their life force, of entire populations that had withered under her ancestors' hunger. They told of wars that had raged for centuries, of peace treaties signed in blood, of a species so fearsome that even mentioning their name could cause seasoned warriors to shiver. The tales grew with each telling, painting her people not as the complex civilization they truly were, but as monsters lurking in the darkness between stars. She lifted her chin slightly, maintaining the regal bearing that had been drilled into her since childhood. A queen does not show weakness. A queen does not reveal longing. A queen stands alone if necessary, because that is what duty requires. These were the lessons carved into her very soul, repeated like mantras through centuries of rule. Yet tonight, surrounded by connection and warmth, those lessons felt more like chains than wisdom. A server approached, a six-armed being from the Hospitality Guild, offering her a crystal goblet filled with the synthetic blood substitute that had been specially prepared for her dietary needs. She accepted it with a gracious nod, though the liquid tasted like copper and regret compared to the sustenance her body truly craved. Another accommodation, another reminder of how different she was from everyone else in this room. As she sipped the artificial nourishment, her enhanced hearing picked up fragments of conversation from around the ballroom. The heliarch from the sun-touched worlds was explaining the intricacies of solar cultivation to a fascinated group of cave dwellers. A pair of quantum engineers were discussing the poetry hidden in mathematical equations, while their partners listened with genuine interest. Everywhere she looked, beings were finding common ground across the vast differences of their origins. But when others noticed her watching, their conversations would pause. Smiles would become more polite, more distant. They would nod respectfully in her direction, before quickly finding reasons to move to other parts of the room. She was acknowledged, certainly. Her political importance made that unavoidable. But acknowledged was not the same as accepted, and it certainly was not the same as wanted. The weight of centuries pressed down upon her shoulders. How many gatherings like this had she attended over the long span of her life? How many times had she stood at the edges of celebration, welcomed in theory but isolated in practice? Her people's integration into the galactic community had been a hard-won victory, achieved through decades of careful diplomacy and painful compromise. They had earned their place at the table through sacrifice and patience, proving that they could coexist peacefully with other species. But earning a place at the table, she had learned, was different from being invited to sit close enough to feel the warmth of companionship. The music shifted to a slower melody, and couples began to form on the dance floor. Lyralei watched as beings who had never met before tonight found courage to extend their hands to one another, to risk the beautiful vulnerability of connection. The sight filled her with a longing so acute it was almost physical pain. When had she last danced? When had she last felt the simple joy of another being's willing touch? She was contemplating a graceful exit when she noticed him. He stood near the refreshment area, apart from the crowd but not isolated in the way she was. Where her solitude felt imposed from outside, his seemed chosen. He was human, she realized with mild surprise. Earth had only recently joined the galactic community, and their representatives were still rare at these high-level gatherings. Most humans she had encountered were either overwhelmed by the scope of interstellar society or trying too hard to prove they belonged among the older species. But this one was different. He moved with quiet confidence, not the brash boldness she had observed in some of his species, nor the nervous energy of someone out of their depth. His dark hair was slightly mussed as if he had been running his hands through it while thinking, and his formal diplomatic attire was worn with the comfortable ease of someone who cared more about function than appearance. What caught her attention most, however, was the way he watched the room. His gaze moved from group to group with genuine curiosity and what appeared to be warmth. When his eyes found hers across the ballroom, he didn't look away immediately as others had. Instead, he met her gaze directly, offering a small smile that seemed to contain no fear, no calculation, no political agenda. Just simple human acknowledgement of another being's existence. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across the space of the ballroom. Then, to her absolute astonishment, he began walking toward her. Lyralei felt her breath catch in her throat. In 300 years of attending diplomatic functions, no one had ever simply walked up to her without a formal introduction, without a specific agenda, without the careful protocols that usually governed interactions with her rank. Her first instinct was to assume he was making some kind of mistake, that he had confused her for someone else or misunderstood some aspect of the social situation. But as he drew closer, his steps never wavered. His expression remained open and genuinely friendly, with perhaps just a hint of nervousness that made him seem more real, more approachable than the polished diplomats she usually encountered. When he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he stopped and offered her a slight bow that managed to be respectful without being obsequious. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying a pleasant warmth. "I'm James Chen from the Earth delegation. I was wondering if you might be interested in some company this evening. These large gatherings can be a bit overwhelming, and I noticed you seemed as ready for genuine conversation as I am." The directness of his approach caught her completely off guard. No elaborate flattery about her legendary beauty. No nervous stammering about the honor of meeting her. No immediate pivot to discussing trade agreements or territorial boundaries. Just a simple, honest acknowledgement that they were both alone in a crowd and might benefit from each other's company. She began, then paused. The response protocols drilled into her over centuries of rulership seemed inadequate for this moment. "Yes, I think I would like that very much." James smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. She could see genuine pleasure in his eyes, as if her acceptance of his company was a gift rather than a diplomatic courtesy. "Wonderful. I have to admit, I've been curious about your perspective on all this." He gestured to the swirling crowd around them. "The cultural exchange happening here tonight is remarkable, but I imagine it looks quite different when you've been part of this community for centuries rather than months." As they began to talk, Lyralei found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in longer than she could remember. James asked thoughtful questions about her experiences, listened to her answers with genuine attention, and shared his own observations about the complexities of interstellar diplomacy with a mixture of humor and insight that she found unexpectedly refreshing. He didn't flinch when she mentioned the darker aspects of her people's history, nor did he offer empty platitudes about the past being behind them. Instead, he spoke thoughtfully about the challenges all species faced when trying to evolve beyond their origins, and about the courage required to choose connection despite the risk of rejection. "On Earth," he said at one point, "we have a saying that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of fear. I think that applies to more than just physical bravery." As the evening progressed, they found themselves moving naturally to a quieter area of the ballroom, where the conversation could flow more freely. James told her about his homeworld, about the blue skies and vast oceans that she had only seen in diplomatic briefings. In return, she found herself sharing memories of her own world, of the silver forests and crystal cities that most other species would never see. When the music shifted again to a particularly lovely melody, James hesitated for just a moment before extending his hand to her. "Would you care to dance, Your Majesty? I should warn you, I'm still learning the steps to some of the more universal forms, but I promise not to step on your feet." Lyralei looked down at his offered hand, then back up to his face. In his expression, she saw no fear of her nature, no calculation of what dancing with her might mean for his career or his planet's standing in the galactic community. She saw only a man who had enjoyed her company and wanted to continue sharing this moment of connection. For the first time in decades, she set aside the weight of her crown and simply accepted. His hand was warm against hers as he led her onto the dance floor. They moved together slowly, finding their rhythm among the other couples. James was right about still learning some of the steps, but he moved with natural grace and was quick to adjust when she guided him through the more complex sequences. More importantly, he seemed completely comfortable with her presence, with the way other dancers gave them subtle space, with the attention their pairing drew from around the room. "Thank you," she said quietly as they swayed to the music. "For what?"
"For seeing me," she replied.
"Not my reputation, not my title, not my species. Just me." James smiled, and she realized that this simple human had given her something precious beyond measure. For the first time in centuries, Queen Lyralei felt truly seen, truly chosen, truly welcome in the warmth of another being's company. As the music played on around them, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps the next gathering would be different, that perhaps she would not stand alone at the edge of the room, but would instead arrive with a partner who valued her presence not for political gain, but for the simple joy of her company. The crown upon her head felt lighter now, transformed from a burden into something she wore by choice rather than obligation. And in the gentle strength of James's embrace, she found something her ancestors' conquest had never achieved. A connection freely given, freely received, and freely cherished. The dance continued, and with it, the quiet beginning of something beautiful and unexpected in the vast loneliness of space.